Did you know that Dario Argento made a movie starring Jennifer Connelly and Donald Pleasance? It's called Phenomena. It's a movie with a very inspecific name. Could be about anything, but it's about bugs, mainly. This movie's in English. It's set in Switzerland, with most of the characters being foreigners, not Swiss, I mean. There's a lot of dubbing going on here, not uncommon in Italian films, even in 1985. My copy of this movie randomly switches languages at several points. Just for a few seconds, Jennifer Connelly starts speaking Italian. This happens multiple times. Overall, this is not the highest quality movie, but quality, I guess, never was Dario Argento's main goal. I'll try to demystify this movie a little bit. I'll talk about giallo films, about Jennifer Connelly, about bugs, and who knows what else. The basic idea of this movie is that Jennifer, that's the name of Jennifer Connelly's character, Jennifer is the daughter of a famous actor. And for one reason or another, she's sent to boarding school in Switzerland. There happens to be a serial killer roaming the neighborhood of the school, and Jennifer also happened to be able to communicate telepathically with insects, with bugs. She befriends a legendary entomologist, played by Donald Pleasance, and his pet chimp, played by Tonga, who also starred in Bingo Bongo, as I'm sure you know. I love looking at animal profiles on IMDb, by the way. I may do a video about some animal actors one of these days. The storyline of this movie is wonderfully convoluted, and it gets even better about 2/3 of the way through the movie when it seems like Dario lost the script and decided to start over with a new concept. That's not entirely fair. There are some nice callbacks throughout, actually. But the point is that this movie throws a ton of horror tropes at you. I'll come back to maybe why that is or what the effect is. Phenomena is just under 2 hours long. There's also a shorter version of this movie without all the creepiest parts. It's called Creepers. The first half of this movie is kind of slow. It almost seems like Dario Argento is stalling. It almost seems like he wants it to seem like he's stalling. Yeah. The final act picks things up a lot, and the movie takes about 5 left turns in a row. Despite being full of tropes, Phenomena is actually unpredictable, and it's fun to watch. Donald Pleasance brings a lot to this movie. He's central to the opening sequences. He's in the beginning, and he's good, so you don't realize that the acting in this movie is actually going to be terrible until Jennifer Connelly shows up. The second best performance in this movie comes, I think without a doubt, from Tonga, the chimp. There's some impressive animal training in this movie. Apparently the chimp was actually somewhat hard to work with, bit Jennifer Connelly. There's also a bunch of insects in this movie, and the acting from the insects is pretty good. Reminds me of Phase 4. Jennifer Connelly was about 15 when this movie came out. She is sexualized to some degree, but the closest relationship she develops is with Donald Pleasance, and it's more of a father-daughter kind of thing. Jennifer's character is kind of interesting. She's the daughter of this movie star, which sort of codes her as being needy or stuck up. And she is a bit self-centered at times, right? Almost like the character in the horror movie who is not going to make it. On the other hand, she has magical powers, and she gets bullied by the other kids. Well, this is sort of coding her as something else, as the hero of a coming-of-age fantasy film, right? So the movie is sort of muddling convention here, which could be a feature or a bug. Of course, things are muddled fundamentally by the fantasy elements of the film and the horror elements of this film coming together. IMDb lists this movie as fantasy horror, a genre I'm not sure really exists. I guess maybe Guillermo del Toro would argue otherwise, but I'm not sure. To me, fantasy doesn't simply mean something that isn't real. It's more something beyond reality that people crave, like magical powers, right? It's something that can set your imagination alight, or if not your imagination, the imagination of a young child, right? I'm not sure this movie does that exactly. Like I said, kind of an interesting collision of some different genres. The music in this movie is great. It comes from Goblin, just like some of Argento's other movies. Phenomena also features some tracks from Iron Maiden and some less famous bands that sound a lot like Iron Maiden. These songs are jarring, but they kind of fit the vibe. I'm split on whether they should be in the movie. Those are kind of the basics of the film. If you haven't seen a Dario Argento movie, go watch Suspiria and then come back. Otherwise, I'd say this movie is okay. This might be the first Giallo film I've covered on this channel. I guess Baba Yaga maybe counts. I don't really remember. We've done a lot of movies by this point. It's an interesting genre. I first became aware of these Giallo movies when I was looking for cool soundtracks. I'm a big fan of Ritz Ortolani, for instance, who did the music for movies like Mondo Cane. I listened to a bunch of his music long before I'd seen any of these movies, and I always wondered how such beautiful scores became attached to such trashy movies. Now, I think there's a lot of different factors here, but once I started watching Giallo films, I realized that it isn't some weird coincidence that they have cool music, because stylization is kind of the defining logic of the genre. Well, one of them at least. One thing that's interesting about Phenomena is that this is not an amateur movie, right? There are international actors here. Jennifer Connelly had really only been in a certain Sergio Leone film at this point, and a Duran Duran music video. But Donald Pleasence was well known. Apparently, they also spent quite a bit of money breeding insects for the film. So they had some money kicking around on the set, right? And this is what they came up with, right? Limitations probably didn't define this movie exactly. Interesting. I mentioned earlier that there are a ton of tropes in Phenomena. I don't think that's some kind of accident. Giallo movies have an interesting relationship with the horror genre itself. This movie opens up with a bus driving down a road. Okay, nothing wrong with that. Well, then you see that a girl has been left behind on this mountain road, right? She's waving after the bus, but it's pulling away, right? Now we're cooking. This is horror, right? This is what we came to see. Most horror movies work like this to some extent. When you hear the suspenseful music start, you don't think, huh? Where's that sound coming from, right? Interesting question if sound can inherently be suspenseful or not. But either way, horror movies clearly rely on genre convention all the time. Of course, on the other hand, they need to be surprising, right? So interesting trade-off. How do you lean into convention but also defy convention? I think that's kind of what Giallo movies are all about. They really play with this stuff. They point conspicuously at the tropes, but they also have a lot of really weird, extreme stuff in them that you're not going to see coming, right? These are sort of meta films. At the very least, I think this would explain why so much of this movie is over the top, why so many of the lines seem like they're in quotation marks. There are a number of Argento hallmarks here as well. I'm not a huge expert in his movies, but I recognize the secret passages, the back rooms from some of his other movies. Argento's movies often remind me of things that are not movies, like obstacle courses, right? An obstacle course that characters have to run through. There is a physicality of these movies, things getting stabbed, things getting impaled, and yeah, people running around having to jump and like swing from the trees and such. This kind of drama, this like physical drama, isn't unheard of. I mean, you think about the Poseidon Adventure maybe, or Galaxy Quest, I think has a few scenes like that. But it's not super common. The movie also reminds me of one of those macabre wax museums. It kind of feels like we are moving between a few different dioramas here. I don't have a lot more to say about this movie, to be honest. I don't think it's particularly deep. There are quite a few movies about bugs out there. I've covered a few of them on the channel. I mentioned Phase 4 already. I did the old Ants and A Bug's Life double header. But it's hard to draw much of a parallel between this and anything else. In Phenomena, the significance of the insects is a bit muddled. They are mainly a macabre thing. They're associated with death and decay. The maggots show up only after people have passed away. They show up to eat flesh, right? There's also something sort of sacred about them, some natural element, right? Jennifer Connelly is a friend of the insects. They help her out. So kind of macabre, but kind of cool. And, that is another interesting angle on horror movies sometimes is that, sometimes people actually come to be associated with the bad guys in the horror movie to some extent, or come to possess some sort of gothic sensibility through these movies, even if they're kind of rooting for the bad guys. So the bugs in this movie, well, I don't know. I mean, you don't see many people watch this movie and then adopt a bunch of maggots to breed in their apartment. I don't think I'll be doing that, at least. So yeah, we have sort of a macabre thing, okay, but it's also serving as this like friend, companion, man's best friend, the beetle, right? But on the other hand, it's a bug. It's something that people are not that thrilled about in general. So like I said, it's a little bit muddled, maybe, or at least I don't know exactly how to draw a line between this and other bug movies. Of course, I don't know why you would assume that every bug movie would necessarily reach the same conclusion about anything. Anyway, there is a hint of generational conflict in this movie. I was expecting the students at the boarding school to wear traditional uniforms. It seems like a conservative institution, right? But they actually wear hip, contemporary clothes, which are a little bit jarring. In Jennifer's room, there's a scene in a classroom too that really nails, really zooms in on like some sort of generational conflict where the teacher is discussing the classics and the students are more interested in the popular music of the time. This doesn't really go anywhere. A little bit of a hint of generational conflict, like I said, but yeah, hard to draw much of a conclusion about that, at least for me. In Jennifer's room, the television is always on. Maybe we have some comment on modernity here, or maybe this is just a prop for exposition, right? We see news reports about the killer on this TV a couple of times. At one point, there's a clip of some African dancers on this TV. A bold critic might conclude something about this, but not me. At one point, Jennifer is getting an EEG, and the apparatus she is hooked up to looks an awful lot like a crown of thorns. She's dressed in white, of course, as she is throughout the film. Again, I don't think I'll be taking that bait. Argento has apparently said that this movie was a meditation on World War II, on what would have happened if the bad guys had won. I'm not sure this would come to mind without prompting, but this is a story of cruelness in many ways. The strict headmistress is cruel. There's some rigid institutions, right? Social rigidity. The other girls at the school are cruel. It's interesting that all these cruel characters are women. Conclude what you want about that. Also interesting that this movie should be set in Switzerland, not in Italy. Switzerland is a country neutral in the war, a place where institution, maybe has a particular tone or something like that. So I do think there's something about this. There's sort of a macabre rigidity to this society. Clockwork or trains or something like that. Buses play a bit of a role in this film. Being a bit vague here, but this allusion to the war is not, I believe it's some. Let me put it like that. I'll leave you with something I really like about this movie. Towards the end, there is a scene set on a lake at night, and some spooky stuff is happening. But it's also kind of serene. It's a beautiful night, right? And Jennifer's out on the lake in the moonlight. I like the tone here, how it's spooky and serene both. Of course, this movie in many ways operates in the domain of tone, and I think it does a pretty good job at that. So that's Phenomena. Look, it's hard. It comes nowhere close to a movie like Possession, which I watched last week, but very different thing. If you know of any other films by international directors that are in English with, international casts and that are horror films that start with the letter P, I'm in the market. I'd like to do another one next week, but I'm not sure they exist. Anyway, I'll see you then.